Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today we'll talk about a fatal accident that happened on July 4th that claimed the life of my friend Brad Launchpad Marzari, who was well known in aviation circles and who was a popular contributor to the Airplane Geeks podcast that I co-host. Last week in episode 193, we talked with AOPA Pilot Magazine columnist Dr. Catherine Cavagnaro about the subtleties you'll find in the performance charts in an aircraft's POH. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out. And if you haven't done so already, please click on the subscribe button or the follow button in whatever app you're listening to me on. And if you find any value in this show, hey, please consider supporting it. You can do so financially by signing up to make a monthly donation at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome because you're an awesome listener, or you can make a one-time donation via PayPal at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. Thanks so much for your support. Now, one of the few downsides of being in aviation is that from time to time we lose close friends in airplane accidents, and it's a pain that never really quite goes away. I can easily think of 5 pilots I've known who were in plane crashes and a 6th pilot who was a passenger in a Civil Air Patrol crash. And no, these weren't social media friends. These are people who I had met personally, had a relationship with, and in a few cases had actually flown with. Most of the time when we hear about a plane crash, it doesn't involve someone we know and we soon forget about it. But when we know the person, it leaves a deeper impact, and it's not something you get over immediately. Hopefully you don't know anyone who's died in a plane crash. But the more deeply you're involved in aviation and the longer you've been a pilot or aviation fan, the more likely you will eventually know someone who's died in a crash. And it never gets easier. I was stunned when I learned on July 4th that my friend Brad Launchpad Marzari had passed away earlier in the day in a fatal plane crash in Texas. I want to tell you a little bit about Brad, tell you what's known about the accident, and tell you why I believe Brad was a hero at the end, who I think sacrificed his life to avoid crashing into a densely packed neighborhood full of houses. Since you listen to this show, there's a good chance you also listen to the Airplane Geeks podcast that I co-host. And if you listen to that show, you're probably familiar with our reporter at large, Launchpad Marzari. But more than likely, you didn't know that his first name was Brad. That's because he insisted that we always refer to him as Launchpad. And he was a little upset that one time a co-host slipped and called him by his first name on the air. Now, I never knew where the name Launchpad came from, so I asked his wife, Gabby. I first talked with Gabby just 3 or 4 weeks ago when I was talking with Launchpad by phone, and Gabby joined us on the call. She's a delightful German woman, and unfortunately she and Launchpad, while married, lived in separate countries for several years since her job was in Germany and he was at Fort Hood in Texas. But the two traveled frequently between the continents to see each other. Gabby had just moved to Texas only 2 months ago, so she and Brad were finally together again, along with their growing menagerie that included rabbits, a dog, a cat, and a cockatiel. Here's what Gabby wrote to me yesterday about the name Launchpad. Launchpad being a Disney character, a duck, that always crashes his planes. His quote, "Any crash you can walk away from is a good one." Well, that didn't hold true for last night, though. I was unfamiliar with this Disney character, so I looked it up. The fandom.com site says that Launchpad McQuack is a pilot introduced in Disney's 1987 to 1990 TV series DuckTales as Scrooge McDuck's pilot. He was later featured as Darkwing Duck's sidekick in the crossover TV series of the same name and appears as a main character in the 2017 DuckTales reboot series. Under personality, it says, a lovable doofus, Launchpad McQuack may seem absent-minded, yet despite often making mistakes, he always gets his assigned task done completely in the end, and as such, he is a valuable helper for Scrooge McDuck, despite often irritating Scrooge with his ignorance. He is a gentle giant, now that part fits with Brad, and also very charming and witty, which also fits as well. Additionally, Launchpad isn't afraid of anything and remains calm and positive in extreme and intense scenarios, never panicking or losing his cool. In fact, the only things that come close to scaring Launchpad are Scrooge's temper tantrums. He gets on with Huey, Dewey, Louie, and Webby very well and is fiercely protective of them. In fact, if the Duckling Quartet is endangered, he employs his finest piloting skills toward rescuing them. He is also very popular with women. Physical appearance, Launchpad is an anthropomorphic duck and is one of the tallest and bulkiest anthropomorphic animals in the Disneyverse, rivaling Pete. He dresses like a pilot with scarf, goggles, a helmet, baggy pants, boots designed for big webbed feet, a belt, and a leather jacket. Launchpad also has an imposing athletic physique with a narrow waist, deep rib cage, and generally thicker limbs than most other Disney characters, making him the muscle in Scrooge's and any other teams he's a part of. For those of you who ever met Brad in person, you know physically that he was a big man, standing at least 6'3" and perhaps a little taller. So in many ways, he fits the Launchpad Disney character whose name he adopted for himself. When I first heard of his death, the first words that popped into my mind were that he was larger than life, and I've seen several other people post the same phrase online when talking about Brad. And we all mean it in the best possible interpretation of that phrase. So often when we think of people who are larger in life, they're actually scam artists or narcissists who are self-promoters who exaggerate their accomplishments. That was definitely not Brad. He was the real deal. Now, his big passion in life was aviation, and he did everything in his power to promote it. He was president of his local EAA chapter. He participated in the Young Eagles program, which gives free airplane rides to teenagers. This week on the Airplane Geeks podcast, you can hear episode 660, which we recorded in memory of Launchpad, and one of the stories told was how he conducted his Young Eagle rides. Brad always had a touch of showman in him, and he loved his warbird airplane. Apparently, when briefing teenagers before a flight, he would tell them that, "You are now in a warbird, and in a warbird there are no passengers, only crew. So you are part of the crew. Here's your checklist. Now start reading the items on the checklist." And you've got to give him credit. He'd found a way to immediately capture the attention of a teenager and to get them engaged in the flight. Another of his passions was his airplane. I'm sure he never could have been content with a run-of-the-mill airplane. So when he bought a plane a couple years ago, he bought a Focke-Wulf. Yes, that Focke-Wulf. The German company that built the famous FW-190 fighter plane used in World War II. Now, Brad didn't have a fighter aircraft. Instead, he had a P-149D that was designed by Piaggio, but built under license by Focke-Wulf. According to Wikipedia, the P-149 was developed as a four-seat touring variant of the earlier P-148. The P-149 is an all-metal, low-wing cantilever monoplane with a retractable tricycle landing gear with room for 4 or 5 occupants. The prototype first flew in June of 1953. Only a few were sold until the German Air Force selected the aircraft for a training and utility role. Piaggio delivered 72 aircraft to Germany, and another 190 were built in Germany by Focke-Wulf as the FWP-149D. Now, Brad's aircraft was built in 1960. He found it in Canada and brought it back to the U.S., and it was often the subject of some of his recordings for the Airplane Geeks podcast. One of the funniest ones I remember was a discussion about the motorized tug that he used to move the airplane in and out of his hangar. Now, for a really light aircraft, you might use a simple tow bar to manually push a plane in and out of a hangar. But as planes get heavier, a motorized tug can be really helpful. But even the simplest ones run thousands of dollars. And for some reason, Launchpad decided he would much rather build his own motorized tug than spend the money on a commercially built one. So first, Launchpad found something you wouldn't normally expect to find anywhere in the entire state of Texas, and that was a used snowblower. Now, it doesn't snow a lot in Texas, so there can't be many snowblowers in the state, but Brad found one. He and his friend modified it to strip off the snowblowing components, saving the frame, the wheels, the gasoline engine, and the speed controls. I thought one of the most ingenious hacks was how they decided to attach the tug to the nose wheel of the airplane. Brad went down to the local hardware store and bought a couple of sockets that you might use with a socket wrench. He and his friend then welded the sockets to the snowblower frame, and I believe the sockets were then placed over pins on the nose wheel strut. It was really an ingenious little contraption, and the result was that Brad had probably one of the very few custom snow tugs for moving an aircraft in and out of a hangar. You can hear the full story of his snow tug on episode 639 of the Airplane Geeks podcast. But I think Brad's biggest joy in life was actively participating in air shows. Every year, he would take 2 weeks of his vacation time from work to spend a week at Sun and Fun in Florida and another week in AirVenture Oshkosh. But Brad didn't just walk around and attend an air show. He was always actively involved with them in various ways. One of the main things he did was to help staff the booth for the Pipistrel Aircraft Company. He often had a big grin on his face when he said that he would be working as a booth babe at an air show. Of course, at some trade shows, the booths are staffed by attractive young women, and I think Launchpad got a kick out of comparing himself to them because, well, there was absolutely no comparison, but he still was a booth babe. Brad loved his association with Pipistrel, and I think most of the hours he spent working for them were non-paid volunteer hours, simply because he loved the company's products so much. Besides handing out literature in the booth and talking to people about the airplanes, he also arranged rides for members of the media so they would have more exposure to the planes. So, for example, in 2019, at the Sun and Fun show, Brad arranged for me to get my first demo flight in a Pipistrel Cetus. Now, that's a parachute-equipped aircraft with a long wing and a phenomenal glide range. I remember the demo pilot saying that if we pulled the power back, we could glide all the way back to the airport. I was skeptical, but indeed, it was one heck of a gliding aircraft. Brad also organized the annual Potapalooza event hosted each year by Pipistrel at their outdoor display booth at AirVenture. Many of the attendees were podcasters and podcast listeners. Launchpad was always the ringmaster at these events and handed out raffle prizes that he had spent weeks collecting before the event. Dan Pimentel, a friend and contributor to Flying Magazine, emailed me about Brad and this event a day ago. He wrote, "While I've had only a few interactions with him, the one big one I had showed he had a lot of good character. He contacted me 1 year before Oshkosh and wanted to merge his Potapalooza with my Oshbash. I respectfully declined as I wanted full control over my event. He was gracious and understood, and we worked it out with EAA's Dick Napinski, so I could have my deal on Tuesday and he'd do Potapalooza on Thursday. Once that was worked out, we both cross-promoted the other's events, and it all worked out very well." Mark Newton, who's a pilot from Australia that I met when I was teaching at a Cirrus event in his country a few years ago, also wrote about meeting Launchpad at AirVenture. He wrote, "I just heard news about Launchpad, devastating. I met him for the first time outside Andy and Ed's at Oshkosh when I showed up jet-lagged with Bass Sheffers and ATC Ben. Exactly the same in real life as the image he's portrayed on the podcast. Warm, welcoming, friendly, larger than life. He didn't know me from a bar of soap, but welcomed me to his impromptu burgers and root beer tailgate party like an old friend. My paths crossed with his, your paths were intertwined. I'm so unspeakably sorry for your loss. Thanks, Mark." And Captain Al of the Airline Pilot Guy podcast also met Launchpad at AirVenture and wrote, "I was very sad to hear of Brad's passing. Sadly, I now need 2 hands to count my flying friends' fatalities. Perhaps a moment to reflect that each one of them died doing something they were passionate about, a vocation, a love, maybe even an addiction. I've often thought that for aviators, if there is a way to choose, then flying off this world is the way to go. Like many, I met Launchpad at Oshkosh, and I'll be honest, I'm usually skeptical of exceptionally friendly people, but Brad was different. He had a clever and resourceful mind and a true heart of gold. There will be an empty space at Oshkosh. Captain Al." Launchpad was also the ringmaster for an event he organized at Sun and Fun. Each year he put together an evening show on the deck of Sun and Fun Radio that featured rotating interviews with a number of podcast hosts. The event ran 3 hours long and included the hosts for perhaps a half dozen different popular aviation podcasts. Launchpad recruited the guest hosts, put together a schedule for the interviews, and ran the event, which was coordinated with Dave Schallbetter of EAA Radio. Listeners in the area could hear the interviews over EAA Radio and also over the internet through liveatc.net. Of course, Launchpad spent most of each day at Sun and Fun working as a booth babe in the Pipistrel booth. In addition to attending AirVenture and Sun and Fun each year, Brad also made it a point to attend the Paris Air Show. According to the Airplane Geeks podcast website, he attended every Paris Air Show since 1991. How did he manage to do that? Well, Launchpad lived in Germany for 25 years, first as a captain in the U.S. Army and later as a civilian employee for the Department of Defense. The day after Brad died, I posted a story on my Facebook page about his death, and it now has comments from over 70 people. The common theme was, what a nice person he was. Glenn Towler wrote, "A huge loss, one of the nicest people I have known. He did so much for young eagles, too. I will miss him so much." And Tracy Patterson-Marks wrote that he was certainly larger than life, and Jonathan Goldstein also wrote the same, that he was larger than life. I think because Launchpad did seem larger than life to most of us, and perhaps because he seemed like a gentle giant who was competent at many things, it makes it harder to fathom how he could have died in an airplane accident. Because if he was a good pilot, how could he have crashed? And if each of us believes that we're good pilots, then we're forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that any of us could also end up someday dying in an airplane crash. One of the ways as pilots we deal with that uncomfortable truth, that we too could die in an airplane, is to learn everything we can about airplane accidents so we can hopefully avoid some of them ourselves. So let's talk about this accident. Although the NTSB preliminary report has not yet been released on the crash, there are a number of data points available that tell us a lot about his final flight. I believe Brad spent the day of July 4th displaying his Focke-Wulf airplane at the New Braunfels Airport, which is south of Austin, Texas. At about 4:30 p.m., he took off to fly back to his home airport in Killeen, Texas, about 100 miles away in north of Austin, Texas. The trip was flown for the most part between 3,500 feet and 4,300 feet, with a fair amount of change in altitude, perhaps because he was avoiding clouds in the area. We can see from FlightAware.com that there was a thunderstorm in his path and that he deviated well to the east to fly between some nearby cells. And while you might think this was a weather-related accident, that does not appear to be the case. By the time Launchpad was approaching his home airport, the METAR was showing clear skies. Somewhere near the end of the flight, Launchpad apparently began having engine problems. On the Killeen Police Department Facebook page, 3 separate eyewitnesses observed the plane having trouble. One report from a captain at SkyWest said, "I heard the pilot communicate his Mayday call for severe engine problems and loss of power. Communicated with ATC and reported the incident while communicating with him during his engine trouble. Prayers for his family." Another eyewitness wrote, "Just saw this little plane, I think it was a beige or yellow tint with some green, go over our house rather low, and it was sputtering like crazy as it went towards Killeen." And another person wrote, "Engine trouble, it flew over my house while cooking hamburgers out, maybe 150 feet up, and it was on its way down." Looking at the FlightAware.com data for his flight, it's unclear exactly when he had the problem, as he could have reduced power and airspeed even on a normal descent to the airport. Also, the FlightAware data ends about 2.5 nautical miles from the crash site, presumably because the plane dropped below ADS-B coverage. What we can see in the last 3 minutes of the data is that for most of that time, Brad was around 3,000 feet, but his ground speed dropped steadily in that time from 155 miles an hour down to 76 miles per hour. During that time, the aircraft only descended 300 feet, dropping from 3,100 feet to 2,800 feet. I believe during this time, Brad was experiencing at least partial power loss, and that he traded airspeed for altitude by holding his altitude relatively constant as the speed dropped from cruise speed down to an approach for landing speed. By the way, stall speed for the Focke-Wulf is listed on Wikipedia as being 57 miles per hour. The FlightAware track has just one more data point after that, and it's these last 2 data points that I think give us the most insight into the power state of the aircraft. For these last 2 data points, the airspeed is relatively constant. It drops from 76 miles per hour to 74 miles per hour, not much of a change. But the descent rate picks up considerably as the plane dropped from 2,800 feet MSL to 2,300 feet MSL for an altitude loss of 500 feet. Assuming this was a stable descent at partial power, we can figure out his descent angle. Since these 2 data points were 1.2 nautical miles apart and the aircraft lost 500 feet, we can calculate that the aircraft was ascending at 416 feet per nautical mile. When an aircraft is on a 3-degree descent angle, which is common at many airports, the airplane is descending about 320 feet per nautical mile. My home airport has a VASI that's set for 4 degrees, and I calculated long ago that on a 4-degree glide slope, an aircraft descends at about 420 feet per nautical mile. So we can tell from the last 2 data points that he was coming down at about a 4-degree angle. Now, let me use the Cessna 172 for comparison, as I've done a lot of teaching in it, and you've probably flown one yourself. In the newer 180 horsepower versions of the 172, I teach that to fly an ILS at a 3-degree angle, you need a power setting of about 1,800 RPM. Brad was coming down at a 4-degree angle, so it's very likely that his aircraft was still developing some power, which would be consistent with the eyewitness description of a sputtering engine. And had he been in a Cessna 172, his engine would have been putting out somewhat less than 1,800 RPM, which is not enough power to sustain level flight. Of course, the big problem with failing engines and partial panel is that things are likely to get worse. Just because you may have 1,800 RPM now, there's no guarantee whatsoever you'll continue to get 1,800 RPM all the way to the airport. But we humans are optimists by nature, so as long as an engine is putting out some power now, it's easy to rationalize that it will continue putting out that much power until we get to the airport. But that's a terrible trap, because once an engine starts to fail, it will most certainly get worse. But unfortunately, there's no way to tell when it will start to get worse. So a good rule of thumb is that when you have any engine trouble, get it on the ground quickly. Don't fly past perfectly good airports hoping you'll make it back to your home airport. And don't fly past nice, smooth, open fields unless you know you'll continue to have a wide choice of nice fields all the way to the airport. On the day after the crash, I spoke with a reporter who was at the scene of the crash as we were talking, and I wanted to get a feel for the size of the field into which Launchpad crashed. So I asked her, is it as big as a football field? And she said, no, much smaller. Certainly a football field is about the smallest field I'd ever want to put a very slow airplane into, so I wondered why Launchpad chose to put a plane down into such a small area. News reports placed the crash as being somewhere near the intersection of each Stagecoach and East Tremere Road, but it took me a long time to figure out the exact location of the crash, as Stagecoach and Tremere cross in two different places. I was finally able to identify it through a reporter's video that was initially confusing as he had the iPhone camera in selfie mode, so everything was reversed. In that video, I could identify a sidewalk that ended just behind the reporter, plus I could see the back of a road sign and the edge of a gas station on the other side of the street. I then went over to Google Maps, but had a hard time confirming the spot until I realized that a very prominent fence that I was looking for was new. It showed up on Google Maps in some stretches of the road, but not in others, as the photos along the road were collected at different times, some before the fence was built and some after it was built. Ultimately, I was able to identify the crash location within a few hundred feet. But then I noticed something really remarkable. The tiny field into which Launchpad crashed was mostly trees with very little open space. But it was also the very last possible place to go down before reaching a dense housing development between that location and the runway. Literally, for the next 1.7 miles from the crash site to the runway threshold, there was nothing but densely built housing. And you can see that clearly from the image I created for this episode. The big red arrow shows the flight path, with the tip of the arrow ending at the crash site. And on the other side of the nearby road, you see there's nothing but houses. And unfortunately, those roads are narrow two-lane roads that were not at all aligned with the flight path, which meant that landing on those roads wasn't really an option for Launchpad. It was then that I started to wonder if Brad purposely dived his aircraft into the trees at the last second when he realized he would otherwise be coming down in a large housing development. So I looked at the last two data points to extrapolate his flight path. Now, one of the challenges in working with the altitude data from transponders is that it's only reported with 100-foot resolution, which means that the data is rounded up or down as much as 50 feet from the actual altitude. And that gives us a fair amount of uncertainty when extrapolating the data. Assuming Brad continued to come down at about 420 feet per nautical mile, he should have passed over the crash site at somewhere between 1,000 and 1,300 feet MSL, which would be between 200 and 500 feet AGL, as the crash site is at about 800 feet MSL, or about 50 feet lower than the airport. On that flight path, he would have crashed somewhere between 3/4 of a mile to a full mile beyond the actual crash site, though he still would have come up about a mile short of the runway. I think like any pilot would, Brad kept holding out hope that he would make it to the runway. But at some point, he must have come to the realization that he couldn't make it and that he was headed toward a crash point in the middle of a housing development. And I think crashing in the middle of a housing development where there was a high probability that he might injure or kill someone on the ground was an unacceptable outcome to Brad. I've often thought that when we as pilots encounter problems in the air, it's unfair for us to share our misery with innocent people on the ground. I recall about 20 years ago that an airplane came down on a freeway near Concord, California's airport, and the propeller ended up cutting the legs of a young girl sitting in the back of a car. Fortunately, she did recover and everyone survived the accident, but it always seemed unfair to me that innocent people had to share in the pilot's misfortune. We'll never know for sure whether Brad dived the aircraft into the trees, thereby sacrificing himself to save others, but we already have one clue. The wreckage looks very much like a plane that had a near vertical impact with the ground. I saw a picture of it, and the front quarter or maybe third of the airplane was nearly completely demolished, with the empennage remaining nearly intact. My guess is that the NTSB report will show that the wreckage was confined to a very small area, which would be consistent with a near vertical impact. Of course, when pilots stall near the ground, they also have a near vertical impact, so it may be impossible to tell from the wreckage whether a vertical impact occurred from a loss of control from a stall or from a pilot diving to the ground to avert disaster. But one thing we can tell for sure is a pilot's character. And if Launchpad died a hero by avoiding the housing development, it wouldn't be the first time he was a hero. Here's a recording from my friend Micah about our mutual friend Launchpad Marzari, which first aired 6 months ago in episode 635 of the Airplane Geeks podcast. By the way, you can follow Micah's work on Twitter by looking for his Twitter handle, which is MainFly, where Maine is spelled like the state of Maine. As you listen to this story, think about whether Launchpad is the kind of guy who would sacrifice himself to avoid crashing into a housing development.
And by the way, it was Micah who let me know that Launchpad had been having engine troubles. He wrote, yes, he had to replace both magnetos only in the past week, and last month he had oil pressure issues. He had a slow leak going for a long time that I think he finally had fixed last month.
Fire on the Launchpad in 3, 2. I've often told you about some of my experiences during my 3 years living in Pueblo, Colorado. But this story is new, even to me. Well, not exactly new, but although it happened to me, I really didn't find out about it until March of 2020. It may be my most extraordinary Airplane Geek story related to my time in Colorado's Steel City. I moved to Pueblo during the late summer of 1984 to take a job at the university. I remember arriving very late on a Friday night. It had taken me 2 days to drive there from Ohio, with an overnight stop at the Holiday Inn in Lawrence, Kansas. My first day at work was scheduled to be on Monday, so I figured that arriving on Friday would let me settle into my on-campus apartment, rest for a bit after a long 2-day drive, and prepare for an early start on Monday morning. Apparently, that was not to be. At around 7 a.m. Saturday morning, I was awakened by the phone. It was one of the vice presidents, my boss's boss. Micah, he said, we have a bit of an urgent matter we need to talk about. Be in my office in an hour. His office? In an hour? I'd only been to his office one other time, some 3 months before during my interview. I wasn't even sure I'd be able to find his office. Plus, now I was worried. What was the urgent matter that had him telling me to be there on a Saturday morning, 2 days before my scheduled start date? Classes weren't in session, and the place was empty as I took my early August morning cross-campus walk. I managed to find the building, made my way to the right office, and found the VP and my boss there waiting for me. We said our hellos, and they perfunctorily asked me about my drive. Then they brought up the reason for this early Saturday morning meeting. You remember when you interviewed, we told you about the fire in the dorm, they asked? Sure, I said. It was brought up several times. About 18 months prior to my arrival there was a fire in a residence hall that may have been the biggest catastrophe to ever strike the college. People were physically injured, and far more were traumatized. In fact, no one on campus, in town, or in the press could ever speak of the dorm without mentioning the fire. You just couldn't get away from it. They went on. Well, you understand that we know the fire was set. It was definitely arson. And we're pretty sure it was set by one of the residents. Although we have several suspects, we never figured out who did it. Yes, I said, I know. Still wondering why they decided to tell me again at 8 a.m. on a Saturday morning, 48 hours before my start date. You see, they said, one of the suspects is scheduled to move back into the dorm this year, and we don't know if that should be allowed. On top of that, this suspect is part of your student staff. We thought we should talk about it with you before we made any decisions. I can't even explain the feelings I had when they said that. Questions started racing through my mind that I knew I couldn't ask. For example, if you knew this person was an arson suspect, how did you let them through the interview process to become a staff member? I won't go through all the things I didn't ask. If I had asked them, I'm sure I would have been fired before I even started. But I did ask what the police and fire investigator reports had to say, and could I read them? Then came the shocker. They said they didn't have copies of the reports and had never seen them. Huh? I'm not sure what my face looked like on the outside. I know I was trying to hide my surprise. I tried to slow down before I uttered a sound. After a brief pause, that felt like hours to me, but must have only been a few seconds, I said, "Do you think we can get copies of the reports and read them ourselves? That way we can try to make an informed assessment before we make any decisions. Fortunately, they thought that was a good idea. Agreed, got in touch with the attorneys handling the case for the university, and made arrangements for us to drive up to their office in Colorado Springs to read the reports the next morning. On Sunday morning, we got together at about 10 a.m. and drove the 50 miles north to Colorado Springs to the attorney's office. The door was locked, but when we knocked, a young law clerk greeted us and ushered us into a huge, beautiful conference room. All the investigation materials were laid out for us on a big conference table. We sat down and each of us started reading reports. There were state and local police reports, sheriff department reports, state and local fire department reports, and state and local arson investigator reports, just to name a few. After about an hour of reading and several cups of coffee, we all came to the same conclusion. We never found out who set the fire. In fact, it's still a mystery. But we all realized that we couldn't take any chances. We figured out what we had to do and planned our strategy. It wasn't an easy decision, but it worked out in the end, and I spent 3 years in Pueblo. In reading the reports, though, we found that one of the suspects that I want to point out was totally cleared was a man who had been running in and out of the fire rescuing people. He was wearing a Nomex flight jacket along with Nomex gloves and a Nomex scarf and mask. The investigators thought he had a hero complex and had started the fire in order to be heralded as a champion. After all, why would someone have all this fire-resistant clothing available to them in a college dorm and then risk his own life to evacuate people from the fire? Apparently, this person had served a hitch in a U.S. Army aviation unit, and he was still enlisted through the Colorado National Guard in an artillery unit that worked with 8-inch howitzers. He kept all his gear in his dorm room so he could have access to it when and if he was called up for duty. So you may ask, what does this have to do with aviation, or the Airplane Geeks for that matter? That's a good question. Even for me, all this was ancient history, and I mean, I had completely forgotten about it. But then one night, while Launchpad and I were on the phone, he mentioned that he had attended college in Pueblo. He told me that during his last year in the dorm, there was a fire, at which point I shouted into the phone, "That was you?" And then all the memories flooded back. The name I read in the reports about the man in the Nomex was Marzari. He left the college the year before I arrived. But apparently, I've known Launchpad for some 36 years now, even though I've still never met him. And it took a long-distance phone call during the pandemic of 2020 to find out. And sure, while Launchpad flies a Focke Wulf, hosts great parties at Oshkosh, and can tell you more about a pipistrel than you could possibly imagine, he's also been an arson suspect, but turned out to be a hero. And even though we've never actually met in person, I'm very happy to call him my friend. For the Airplane Geeks, here in Portland, Maine, this is your main man, Micah.
That recording has always been my favorite piece of Micah's work, and I want to thank him and the Airplane Geeks podcast for letting me share it here. I rarely use the word hero, but I really think it applies to Launchpad Marzari. He was clearly a hero when he ran in and out of a burning dorm building to help save students. In life, as many friends and I thought of him as being larger than life. And in death, I truly believe that he was once again a hero. A reporter asked my Aviation Geeks co-host Max Flight an interesting question. He asked, what will be the legacy of Launchpad Marzari? And I think he leaves several legacies. One is that you should be passionate about the things in life and the people in life that you love, and you should share your passions with others, especially with children, so they can become inspired by your passion. And above all, be kind and caring. And if you find an opportunity to be a little larger than life, or maybe even a hero who helps others, go for it. By the way, Brad's wife Gabby wrote to me again today. She said, I will visit a funeral home tomorrow in Killeen, have the remains cremated, and the urn sent to Germany, where I will return to once everything here is cleared. He will be in the same grave as my parents and me in the future. The grave is not far, and on the same cemetery in Wiesbaden, Südfriedhof, as the grave of Baron Manfred von Richthofen. That, of course, is the full name of the World War I pilot, known as the Red Baron. She wrote, I think he'll like that. Yes, I think Launchpad would be grinning from ear to ear if we could tell him that he's to be buried in the same cemetery as the Red Baron. So in closing, let me say, Launchpad, You lived a rich life. You were inspiring in both life and in death. And those of us you touched are better for having known you. Godspeed, Launchpad. Godspeed. And so until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.